Hello, everybody. Great to be with you. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. And today I wanted to discuss with you the topic of controversial thinkers, how to study them, how to reason about them, and how to develop your own understanding of the world as you read authors who may disagree with one another about basic issues. And so there's something that I wrote a few days ago on my Twitter, which sort of had me thinking along these lines. I put people who follow me for my work on Dugin. Dugin's a Russian political philosopher, ideologue, and activist. For several years now, I've been translating and discussing his works. People who follow me for my work on Dugin don't like that I'm pro-Israel, and not all of my Jewish friends like that I work on Dugin. And other thinkers like Schmidt, Evola, and Heidegger, these other thinkers, they are often, how could you put it, they don't like Jews or they're anti-Semitic as part of their teaching, as I'll discuss in a minute. But as I wrote, that's too bad, because what you really need to do is read, think, and come to your own conclusions and not just ape a worldview. So that's important, but it's not very easy for everybody to do, I think, because let's say you read Carl Schmitt and you get into the world of Schmitt, friend-enemy distinction, land and sea distinction, political theology, what he writes about the Leviathan, and your mind is going to get programmed in a Schmittian mold. And then you'll be sort of like a Schmitt GPT. You'll be able to analyze any issue and you'll be able to interpret any ongoing event in the world through Schmitt's categories. That's a natural part of learning a thinker. You do that when you study Dugin, Evola. I have some Evola here I'm reading. I'll discuss it a little bit with you shortly here at Evola's Pagan Imperialism. And really in any sort of topic or author that you're studying, you're going to be forming your mind to see the world in some way through their primary lenses. But what's important to do is to know when to kind of loosen that and tighten it, when to include other people's views and when to exclude other people's views for the sake of trying to get a sense of what's going on. So rather than just talk to you about this in an abstract sort of way, I thought I'd walk you through an example, a case study. You can do your own version of this. I will share with you the version of it that I did. So as somebody who's interested in Dugin and is pro-Israel or a Zionist, I support the existence of the state of Israel. That raises a certain kind of conflict because Dugin is an anti-Zionist and most of Dugin's followers hate Israel. So what do you do? So I did this experimental piece of writing back in the day, which is how I walked through for myself. How can I take these two topics that seem to be at odds with one another and develop, a compelling thesis or an interesting idea or just experimental approach to the topic? So that's why it's called an experiment in Jewish Heideggerianism, Zionism, and the fourth political theory, two things that you wouldn't necessarily think belong together. So I'm going to walk through this, and I think it's topical because Israel obviously is in the news more so than usual over the last year, and all the more so over the last couple of weeks with its operations in Gaza sort of wrapping up to a certain extent and its operations in the north beginning. So how do you take something like Zionism and use a completely different theoretical model than what you're used to interpret what it might be or what you might learn about it? So let's just walk through this. This is an example, okay? These are two controversial things in some sense. Zionist political theory and Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory. So this was my attempt to take two controversial things and see whether we can understand each of them better and both of them better. So I did this in kind of point form, and let's just go through it. Zionism as a political concept refers to the establishment of and support for a state, primarily for the Jews, in the land of Israel, historical land of Israel, okay, with disputed frontiers. So it's not exactly ascertained at the outset what's going to be the borders of this land of Israel, but it is, I think, fair to say that Zionism as a political concept refers to the establishment of and support for a state primarily for the Jews, not only for the Jews, but primarily for the Jews, in the land of Israel with disputed frontiers. Okay, by the way, feel free in the chat, which I'll open up at some point, you can test any of these points if you want to, but for now I'm just going to walk through the argument. We can examine, elaborate, and evaluate the concept of Zionism from a variety of ideological perspectives. The range of ideological perspectives available for this purpose can be usefully circumscribed by the notion of the fourth political theory. Okay, so we have a definition of Zionism. We have the idea that you can examine that from a variety of ideological perspectives. And then you have this view that Dugin's model of a fourth political theory gives us a structure for viewing Zionism from a range of ideological perspectives. The fourth political theory states that three political theories dominated the ideological landscape of the 20th century: liberalism, communism, and fascism, or Nazism. So Dugin includes fascism and Nazism, both under the third political theory. It also states that all three theories have run their course and that there's a need to carve out an intellectual space beyond them by means of the concept of the fourth political theory. Okay, so that's like a one paragraph crash course on the idea of the fourth political theory. It's not liberalism, not communism, not fascism/Nazism. It should therefore be possible, I continue, to elaborate, examine, and evaluate the concept of liberal Zionism, communist, socialist, or labor Zionism, and fascist or National Socialist Zionism. Okay, it's a pretty simple point, right? You have Zionism as a political concept, you have the model of the four political theories, and the model of the four political theories gives us in principle 4 ways to interpret Israel. First political theory, second political theory, third political theory, fourth political theory. Pretty basic setup here. It should also be possible to criticize any one version from the perspective either of the other ideology as such, like criticizing communist Zionism from the perspective of liberalism as such, or from the perspective of the other ideological version of Zionism, like criticizing communist Zionism from the perspective of liberal Zionism. Okay, basically we're just doing the permutations, right? Let's say you have fascist Zionism and you can criticize it as a liberal, or you have liberal Zionism and you can criticize it as a fascist, or you have, let's say, labor Zionism and you criticize it as a liberal Zionist. So this is all possible. Suddenly you get a matrix of possible ideological analysis set up here. So that's from the point of view of the 3 political theories. But as I put in point 7, it's also possible to conceive of a fourth political theory, Zionism, which is neither, strictly speaking, liberal nor communistic nor fascistic, but which is developed more or less in accordance with the substantial notions of the fourth political theory. So to repeat, the fourth political theory is Dugin's thing. He tends to be anti-Israel, his supporters all the more so, but it doesn't follow automatically, in my view, that that's like a natural consequence. So why am I showing you this example? We're still going to go through the article, but what I'm trying to show with this example, which is kind of early to draw the conclusion, but still, is that when you study a controversial thinker, whether it's Evola or whether it's Dugin or whoever you think is controversial, the most important thing in some sense is to turn your brain on, right? You don't just want to be seduced by the allure of the controversial and become completely under the spell of a thinker whose worldview you begin to ape or to regurgitate. That's likely to happen. Any school of thought is going to have its apes and regurgitators. That just belongs to the territory. Nietzsche writes about that in Zarathustra. Rather, he depicts it as he depicts the disciples of Zarathustra, including those who ape Zarathustra's teaching. So that just comes with the territory of a school of thought. But it doesn't mean that you have to be the ape. It doesn't mean that you have to be the regurgitator. As you try to develop an understanding of authors, ideas, texts, issues, events, regions, and all of that, you have to have your brain on. And your brain gets shut off by a totalizing worldview that has ready-made answers to every question, especially when they become questions that you no longer raise because you just have memorized the answer. And this is true, I would say, across the board. So I'm not just using this as an example. Dugin, Israel. No, it's really with any sort of topic or issue or question, it's actually not so easy because you have to know what the author is saying. Take Evola. You cannot have a prejudice about who he is or what he thinks. And okay, I'll interrupt my reading of that fourth political theory and Zionism thing because I'll show you what the difficulty is. Let's say that you pick up pagan imperialism. Okay, here you go. Julius Evola, pagan imperialism. You pick it up and you start to read it. Okay, you get a page in. The current civilization of the West is awaiting a profound transformation, without which it is destined sooner or later to meet its downfall. This civilization has brought about the most complete perversion of the rational order of things. It's a realm of materialism, gold, machinery, and numbers, where there's no longer any breathing space, freedom, or light. All right, maybe that appeals to you. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you get into it a page or two more. And then on page 4, so you've been reading for like, let's say 5 minutes, you come across this phrase, anti-philosophy, anti-humanitarianism, anti-literature, anti-religion. This is the premise. Enough must be said to aestheticism and idealism, enough to the thirst of the soul that creates a Semitic God to worship and implore, enough to the need, quote unquote, that binds men like beggars together in a common bond to give them in mutual dependence the substance each lacks. So you're like, okay, the modern world is rubbish, and you're going to be anti-philosophy, anti-humanitarianism, anti-literature, anti-religion, anti-aestheticism. Sorry, Evola, anti-Semitic, he's going to say here too, which maybe does bother you, maybe it doesn't bother you. But at some point you say, really, anti-philosophy? No, I love philosophy, so I'm just going to stop reading. Or he says he's going to be anti-Europe, and you say, anti-Europe? No, we love Europe. We want to save Europe. We're going to put down a book that states that its axiom is anti-Europe. Sorry, there's an even starker statement of his axiomatic thinking here. I just didn't prepare it in advance. So you can imagine somebody reading that 10 lines, and then suddenly Evola's talking about pagan gods, and you're like, no, thank you. Primordial Nordic civilization, Ragnarok. This isn't for me. This isn't for me. Okay, you could do that. And I think people often can be put off by books. Here you go. He says, anti-Europe, anti-Semitism, anti-Christianity. This is our slogan. So now you're a Christian who picks up Julius Evola because you heard that there's something to learn from him. And he tells you, anti-Europe, anti-Semitism, anti-Christianity. This is our slogan. So, no, thanks. I'm not interested in anti-Europe, anti-Semitism, anti-Christianity. Or, you hate Europe, you hate Christianity, you hate Semitism, and you pick it up, you say anti-Europe, anti-Semitism, anti-Christianity. Yes, I'm on board, okay? I love pagan imperialism, and you become an Evola acolyte through and through. That's the aping version of the book. Whether you reject it because you saw a word in it you didn't like, or you fell in love with it because you saw a word in it that other people don't like and you love. These books are meant for reading. Yeah, sometimes they're designed to be exhortations. Sometimes they're designed to be acts of persuasion, certain kind of extended forms of pamphleteering. But the interesting thing is to think about them. What does he mean by Europe? What does he mean by Semitism? What does he mean by Christianity? What of these categories has remained the same? How have they changed? So you read a book like this in order to think with it, to think with the author. So it's kind of surprising. Things I haven't finished reading it, so I can't give you my full review of Evola's pagan imperialism. I'm also not so much of an Evola scholar that I know the details of where it fits in with the rest of his books. I'm just using it as a quick example here. So he develops concepts, conceptual relationships. Like Dugin, we'll go back to the thing I was reading about the fourth political theory in Zionism in a minute. Dugin has concepts with conceptual relationships. Okay, the four political theories is one. The plurality of Daseins is one. Multipolarity is one. The three logoi is one. Apollo, Dionysus, and Cybele. So he's got concepts, okay, that help map out what he's talking about. So Evola has that too. So Evola says, for example, we should be pro-Roman, but we should not allow the Catholic Church to position itself like it has done as the Roman option. So the Catholics say we're Roman, and everything that is anti-Rome is like Freemasonry and Eastern Asiatic teachings. So the Catholic Church has tried to usurp the title of Rome for itself, and it has defined all of the enemies as anti-Rome. And Evola, shifting the conceptual interpretation here, says, no, the church is anti-Rome, even the Catholic Church, all the more so the Protestant Church. And he even, as it were, defends Freemasonry against the attacks of the Catholics. So the reason you read that is not, again, to become a slave ape of Evola's teaching, but to say, wait a minute, how are the concepts being reorganized, reinterpreted, and all of that? Okay, it's pretty funny when he criticizes the Catholic Church for its criticism of Freemasonry. He's like, you say that it's an Anglo movement, but you should know that it has Italian roots, and so on. Okay, so I brought up Evola's pagan imperialism to show you that there can be a temptation to stop reading a book when you see something you don't like. But typically with an intelligent author, now I'm assuming, here in the case of Evola, we've read enough of his books together on this channel, and I've learned more about him from my students. That gives me even more evidence for this. Like, we're dealing with an intelligent person, right? So you can disagree with an intelligent person, but you don't want to be dismissive of an intelligent person. If there's something for you to learn from it, then the only way to do it is to go through it. So when he says I'm anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, anti-Europe, anti-philosophy, fine. Some people will put the book down and never pick it up again, but somebody else has to say, well, hold on a minute. Why is he anti-Europe? Why is he anti-Christian? What does he mean by, is his interpretation of Christianity solid? Is it defensible? Are there, you know what I mean? Are there other details? So let's go back here. This is kind of what I was doing with the case of Dugin, because so many of his followers are just anti-Zionists, and yet his own concepts helped me to think about Zionism, as I show here. So we're on point 8. The research program of a fourth political theory, Zionism, is worth exploring. The main reason that the concept of Zionism is sometimes regarded as being at cross purposes with the ideologies of liberalism. The main reason is that the concept of Zionism is sometimes regarded as being at cross purposes with the ideologies of liberalism and communism, since the notion of Jewish peoplehood inherent to the concept of Zionism is axiomatically incompatible with those ideologies. With liberalism, because of its non-ethnic individualism, like, let's say liberals are individualists, Zionism is like a people political theory, right? The Jewish people. So there's a conflict. Okay? And liberalism has a certain kind of methodological atheism. Zionism doesn't, right? Zionism, with all of its different currents and trends and tendencies and factions, still part of it has like this trace of the holy, right? Whether you think about the Third Temple or Messianism or Jewish law or just the Jewish story, Jewish self-understanding as such, it's got that presence of the divine, and that can be off-putting to liberal individualists with methodological atheism, like a people and their God versus individuals who are methodologically godless. Okay, that creates a conflict. And with communism, because communism is primarily like a class-based approach, whereas that just conflicts with the fundamental axioms of Zionist political theory, perhaps. Another reason is that neither liberalism nor communism is sufficiently amenable to the sacralization of space implied by the notion of the land of Israel or Eretz Israel. So people have a hard time with this too. They usually categorize this, I think, as like apocalyptic. So Israel has, let's say, the Temple Mount, this idea of a third temple, or even the land of Israel as a holy place, the idea of a holy place. You can generalize this outside of the Israeli case. Okay, Mecca, if you want. I think it was Putin who said in 2014 or 15 that he said Crimea is as sacred for Russians as Jerusalem for Jews, something like that. So the idea that a space can be sacred is a non-liberal and non-communist idea. Okay, that's what I'm saying. And it's present in the case of Zionism, not only in the case of Zionism, but also for our purposes in the case of Zionism. So that shows you can't use liberalism and communism to interpret Zionism. They're missing some important pieces, like the idea of the sacralization or sacredness or holiness of places. Okay, point 11. The semantic matrix of the third ideology or political theory, in Dugin's model, that's fascism and National Socialism, is more amenable to both the notion of peoplehood and to the sacralization of space. If communism or socialism is inadmissible because it brackets the concept of the ethnos, nation, or people, by assumption inherent to the political concept of Zionism, National Socialism is admissible because it does not do so. Okay, so this is me saying, in a way, just like a simple ideological analysis, first pass, rough approximation, Israel seems like it fits into the third political theory, fascism/Nazism. Why? Because those political theories have room for the idea of a ethnic people, of a people and a God, of sacred space. That's there, sort of. It's more there in the third political theory than it is in the first and second political theories. Okay? That's not saying Israel is a fascist state. It's saying the analysis of the political concept of Zionism from the point of view of the political theories shows that there's some kinship with the third political theory. Okay, but that obviously is not the last word. So that's why I have the following point. Zionism and the third political theory is also a troubled pair because of the historical experiences of Jews under anti-Jewish Nazism and fascism. Other ideological incompatibilities and errors as such in the third political theory. So even though Israel or Zionism as a political concept has some overlap with what Dugin calls the third political theory, fascism/Nazism, clearly it's not a one-to-one correspondence. That goes without saying. So although third political theory Zionism is worth elaborating, it's necessary to explore ideological alternatives to all three forms of Zionism, and hence to consider the approach of the fourth political theory. Okay, I have to say something else before we go on in that reading for the benefit of kind of newcomers, I guess, or people who don't know this topic that well. There were strands in the foundation of the State of Israel of socialism. Okay, there's like a socialist Zionism. There were socialist parties. There were socialist kibbutzes. Okay, this socialism is part of the initial fabric of the state. So is liberalism. So is this idea that you're going to be a state that protects universal human rights, a democratic state, a liberal state. And so are tendencies of Nazism/fascism. You can read about the Israeli Supreme Court and its founding judges in the decade of its founding who were reading Carl Schmitt's book on constitutional theory, for instance, to try to think about the design of the state. Okay, Israel does not have a constitution. You maybe know that, you maybe do not know that. Israel does not have a constitution. It has its Declaration of Independence, and it has quasi-constitutional basic laws. And the question of how, sometimes a constitution resolves the questions of what kind of government you are. Israel doesn't have a constitution, and a lot of these ideological strands and strains and schools and trends and tendencies remain kind of at war with each other within the state. So that some people really want it to be a liberal democratic state. Some people really want it to be a theocracy. I may read an article with you here shortly that argues kind of along the lines that it should be a theocratic monarchy. If somebody else wants it to be something else, that was never resolved constitutionally because they don't have a constitution. But the jurisprudence of the state, it did at times have recourse to figures like Carl Schmitt in trying to think through state design, constitutional theory. Okay, so there are elements of all three political theories that are present in Zionism, and yet it can be useful to consider it from the point of view of the fourth political theory. So here's how I continue that, point 14. Another reason for exploring fourth political theory Zionism is as follows. By default, Zionism is ideologically characterized as fascistic from the point of view of political theories 1 and 2, meaning that, liberals and communists see Israel as a fascist state. Not always, obviously, but when it acts like a religious, ethno-nationalist sovereign, then it's usually regarded or called even fascist. Whereas it might profitably be thought of as to the right of liberalism, yet not as a fascist phenomenon. We have to perform the experiment. See, this article, this essay is an experiment. We have to perform the experiment of disambiguating fascism as a general negative category from the right, which the concept of the fourth political theory allows us to do. And guys, it's something we've talked about on this channel often, that let's say there's a tendency to call everything slightly right fascist. You know that. It's largely a polemical tendency. That's why my video, Why is Everything Normal Called Fascist, is now the most viewed video on my channel. I think it's got 150,000 views because everybody knows this phenomenon. Oh, you find a beautiful woman attractive? You're a fascist. You would rather be fit than fat? You're a fascist. You'd like to be well educated? You're a fascist. You prefer cleanliness to filth? You're a fascist. Everything gets called fascist. You know that. You don't need me to tell you that. But somehow even more rigorously and at a higher level of how could you put it? When we're not in the gutter, when we're actually dealing with serious things, it's still not obvious that everything slightly to the right should be coded as fascist. That's why I've covered Julius Evola's book, Fascism Viewed from the Right. The whole reason I taught that book on this channel, you can see my video is also pretty well performing, one of the top performing videos on this channel. Why I taught that book was because it breaks the brains of a lot of people that there can be a model in which there's something to the right of fascism. Because for them, fascism just eats the right. Fascism is the right. Fascism is as far right as you can be. Okay, they say maybe you're ultra far right, you're ultra fascist, neo fascist, super fascist, whatever. But Evola shows us, and Dugin shows us, and other thinkers show us that we can expand our thinking to include fascism as a political theory, but also to have more space on the right for other ways of interpreting politics and the world. One of the books I teach in my school is Arthur Moiler Vandenbroek. He has a book called Germany's Third Reich, okay, Germany's Third Empire. If I'm not mistaken, Hitler took the term from Vandenbroek, who was also a translator into German of Dostoevsky. That book was written in the early 1920s. And the reason I teach Vandenbroek's book, Germany's Third Reich, he too goes through a conceptual disambiguation. His book has the following categories. I won't name all of them, but I'll give you a sense of it. Proletarian, socialist, liberal, revolutionary, reactionary, conservative, monarchist. So he disambiguates. A reactionary is not the same as a conservative, may not be the same as a monarchist in all instances. These are different things. So they're all on the right, but they're not equivalent. Same with fascism here. If you say everything on the right is fascist, you just miss everything. Suddenly you're like, Plato's a fascist, Aristotle's a fascist, everybody's a fascist. And that doesn't get you very far. Okay, so as I said here, we have to perform the experiment of disambiguating fascism as a general negative category from quote unquote the right, which the concept of the fourth political theory, in my opinion anyways, allows us to do. By the way, one thing I wrote on this topic that I strongly recommend, I have a video on it, I have an article on it. It's called The Virtues of Right-Wing Anti-Liberalism. That's my kind of programmatic statement that tries to teach people how to reason about the right if they're used to just automatically coding it or calling it fascist. So The Virtues of Right-Wing Anti-Liberalism, you can look at that if you want to. Let's go back here. So the experimental project of the fourth political theory as applied to Zionism therefore means the following. It is worth thinking about Zionism as a political concept beyond the ideologies of liberalism, communism, and Nazism or fascism. So don't just call them, you look at Tel Aviv and you say, Israel's a bunch of liberal, whatever. Or, you say, if you look at the socialist roots of the state, you're like, no, they're a bunch of socialists. Or you look at the fact that they're a strong state for a well-defined, in some sense, people. You're like, no, therefore they're Nazis, fascists. No, so it's worth thinking about Zionism as a political concept beyond the ideologies of liberalism, communism, and fascism. And it's worth using the specific components of the fourth political theory when doing so, at least as a radical experiment. So as an example of how to study a controversial thinker, you don't just parrot or ape, you sort of try to assimilate, think through, and then even in this case, apply. What would it look like if I applied, Dugin, who is an anti-Zionist, Dugin's followers who are anti-Zionist, what would it look like if I actually applied Dugin's model to Zionism to develop a positive account of it? That's an experiment. I'm not saying you have to do exactly that. I'm showing you how, in my case, I tried to think through two controversial topics, Zionism and Dugin, by sort of mashing them together. So let's look at some components of the fourth political theory. In one model, the fourth political theory has a fourfold structure, comprising from lowest to highest, geopolitics, ethnosociology, theology, and Heideggerian philosophy. So this is just something that, so I should add this. I mean, one of the ways, I mentioned this in relationship to Evola, but I got to tell you again, one of the ways that you study a controversial thinker is carefully. Meaning you have to actually understand what they're saying. That's basic. I learned it from Leo Strauss. It may not be basic to everybody. I learned from Leo Strauss, how do you read books carefully? Okay, he gives us examples with Xenophon, with Plato, with Aristotle, Machiavelli, Nietzsche, with the whole canon of historical political philosophy. Strauss shows us how to read extremely carefully and why the only way you can understand an author is by reading him extremely carefully. So that's what I try to do with Dugin over the years. That's why I can't be so dismissive of him or, as other people are who read him less carefully, because there's a lot there that's interesting and valuable. And one of the things is what I just mentioned in one of his books. I think it's in The Rise of the Fourth Political Theory, okay, offhand. But he says, the fourth political theory can be understood as a disciplinary structure, a structure of disciplines, a structure of the sciences. In liberalism, the primary sciences are economics and jurisprudence, economics and law, according to Dugin. So if you interpret a political theory from the point of view of its primary disciplines, In liberalism, the primary disciplines are economics and law. What are the primary disciplines in the fourth political theory? Dugin asks. And he says they are, from lowest to highest, geopolitics, ethnosociology, and theology. 1, 2, 3, corresponding to body, soul, and spirit. Geopolitics is like the body, ethnosociology is like the soul, and theology is like the spirit. And those are the three main disciplines. But as I asked him when I interviewed him back in 2014 or whenever it was, I said, well, what about the place of philosophy in this model? Especially because you, Alexander Dugin, have written books on Heidegger, and you clearly are what I consider a philosophical supremacist, somebody for whom philosophy represents the highest human activity. And he said, philosophy, in particular Heidegger, is like the being towards death of these various disciplines. That's abstract. I'd have to explain to you what Heidegger means by being towards death, but you can just consider it this way, that philosophy is like the secret inner heart of these three disciplines. So you've got body, soul, and spirit, and then you have philosophy as, let's say, you pick your metaphor, okay? As the angel within, or as the active intellect, or as the presence of God in the body, soul, and spirit. Whatever. The point is, in a disciplinary structure, you have geopolitics, ethnosociology, theology, and philosophy. As I wrote here, okay? Point 16, right? In one model, see that? The fourth political theory has a fourfold structure, which I just explained. Geopolitics, ethnosociology, theology, and Heidegger. This model is potentially useful because it allows for specific emphasis on the land of Israel as sacred, together with analysis of its international relations. That's geopolitics. If you take geopolitics and you apply it to Israel from the point of view of the fourth political theory, you get some potential there. Second, ethno-sociological analysis of Jewish peoplehood and its relationship to non-Jewish ethnic groups and peoples in and around Israel becomes now open. So liberalism and communism, they don't really give you the vocabulary for a well-developed ethno-sociology, but that's important in Israel's case. Maybe it's important in the case of all countries, but for sure it's important in the case of Israel. So geopolitics is legitimated, ethnosociology is legitimated. And third point, Torah, meaning the Jewish Bible, Torah as the Hebrew Bible, right? So what Christians call the Old Testament. Torah as a key component of Zionism and in its relationship to geopolitics and ethnosociology suddenly is on the table. So obviously the importance of Jewish law for Israel and the Jewish tradition and Jewish stories and beliefs and all of that, suddenly all of that gets legitimated under the branch of theology. And finally, point D on the Heidegger side, what do we get if we apply the fourth political theory to Zionism? We get a philosophy other than the Jewish philosophies of the first, second, and third political theories. So there were Jewish liberal philosophers. Okay, there are Jewish liberal thinkers. There are Jewish leftist thinkers. There are some Jewish fascist thinkers. But if you take Dugin's model, suddenly you say, well, what if we had, what would it look like to have pro-Israeli Jewish Heideggerians who combine in their thinking geopolitics, ethnosociology, and theology? And there are some, very few, but there are some. And you could never even see them, or you could never even conceptualize them without the help of Dugin's model, let's say. So you have a problem. The problem is that some non-Zionist proponents of the fourth political theory, okay, like neo-Eurasianists and so on, they tend to align themselves with anti-Zionism. So all my Dugin followers, I think 99% of my Dugin followers, they love it when I post something about Dugin. They hate it when I post something about Israel. Okay, they're anti-Zionists. They see in Israel, analytically and rhetorically, an embodiment of the evil first political theory. So they see the United States as an outpost of American liberalism. And they also sometimes accuse it of being fascist, even though many of them are attracted to fascism. And sometimes they see it as a communist or socialist state. And I think partly that's a little bit of ideological aping. I mean, partly it's true that there was a socialist element to the founding of the state of Israel, but you also have cases like this. Let's say, I would say generally speaking, followers of Dugin who are serious followers of Dugin would also be readers of Evola, given Evola's importance for Dugin. And when Evola discusses Semitism, he can't discuss Israel because Israel didn't exist when this book was written. He can't discuss Zionism because it would not really have been on his agenda. But he discusses what he calls Semitism and the Jewish spirit as a kind of Protestant or socialist spirit. So there can be some carryover from the pre-Israeli criticisms of Jews and Semites, where it's kind of like, let's say roughly Nietzschean. Okay, like Jews are, resentful against the strong. They invented a god to punish the strong and to support the weak, and all that. And if you're going to reject the morality of the weak slaves, then you have to assert the morality of the strong masters, and that's going to be anti-Semitic, anti-Christian. It's going to be Roman, and so on. So some of that gets carried over to criticisms of contemporary Israeli life and international relations in a way that doesn't really map. So that's a part of the problem, right? I'm saying the fourth political theory can be used to understand Zionism, and yet many of the adherents of the fourth political theory are anti-Zionists. However, beyond anti-Zionist rhetoric, the fourth political theory is on its own terms potentially a useful theoretical resource for pro-Zionist analysis. For instance, fourth political theory proponents, okay, people who are supporters of Dugin's and of his models, they tended to champion pre-modern traditions. Okay, so the idea, you should know this. If you don't, I'm going to tell you that the fourth political theory, we said, attacks liberalism, communism, and fascism, but it doesn't just attack them for no reason. One of the main reasons it attacks them is because it categorizes them all as modern. That's what they have in common, is that they're modern ideologies. Modernity itself gets interpreted as something bad, and it gets attacked from two flanks, the postmodern and the pre-modern. So there's a weird combination in Dugin's thought of like a pro-postmodern and a pro-pre-modern attack on modernity. Some people today, they are, let's say, adherents of classical teaching. They like classical schools, Greek, Latin, Cicero, Ovid, all of that. They hate postmodernity. So they attack modernity only from the point of view of pre-modernity. Dugin attacks modernity from both pre and post-modernity. Okay, but part of that is this openness to the pre-modern. And a case can be made that a state for the Jews, which is really the political concept of Zionism, is at least as pre-modern as it is modern, since it embodies the concept of a divinely constituted people in a divinely promised land, living more or less and in part under divinely given laws. So there's something obviously pre-modern about Israel. Clearly, there's also something modern about it, and there may be something postmodern about it, but for sure there's something pre-modern about it. Anti-Zionism may not follow from the axioms of the fourth political theory, although it is employed as rhetoric in a given situation on the basis of both a faulty analysis of the phenomenon of Jews, Israel, Torah, and logical application of anti-liberal principles opposing Israel because of opposition to the US. This is me just saying I can understand why fourth political theory people are anti-Zionists. They see Israel and the United States as one thing. That thing is the first political theory, liberalism, and therefore they're anti-Israel. Okay, so it's not really based on analysis of the phenomena. It just is like a logical deduction. Also, there is anti-Zionism among liberals, communists, and fascists of varying degrees and for various reasons. But Zionist theorists may nevertheless draw profitably on liberalisms, communisms, and fascisms and have done so. Let me make that point. By the way, you should know, I'm talking about Dugin, the fourth political theory, and Zionism, but this is an example of, I think, what it's like to reason through a controversial topic independently and not just by aping or regurgitating what an author or school of thought has said. This is what I'm trying to demonstrate. I'm not saying I did it perfectly. I may have made many mistakes along the way, but it's an example. You need to know the topic well enough to reason it through. And you also need to have kind of enough breadth that you're not limited to the worldview version of it. So you have to be able to, like, Zionists don't love that I invoked Dugin, and Duginists don't love that I invoked Zionism. And yet I'm trying to think something through. That's what I'm saying here. So to repeat the argument, okay, I said Zionists could learn from the fourth political theory. They may want to incorporate it despite the anti-Zionism of Dugin's followers, because there's actually something beneficial in thinking about geopolitics, ethnosociology, theology, and philosophy independently of liberalism, communism, and fascism. Another thing is that there have been liberal Jews, even though there were liberal anti-Semites. There have been communist Jews, even though there were communist anti-Semites. And there have been fascist Jews, even though there were fascist anti-Semites. So it's not an argument that there are fourth political theory anti-Semites. That's not an argument against the fourth political theory, because it happens everywhere. Okay, making a case here, you see? So even if all fourth political theory proponents were anti-Zionist, it would not necessarily imply that the fourth political theory is a useless model for favorable ideological analysis and elaboration of the political concept of Zionism. Okay, now we return to an earlier point, which is that I said, fine, Zionism may benefit from the focus on geopolitics, ethnosociology, and theology, but why does it need a deep philosophical foundation? Who cares that Heidegger is part of the fourth political theory? Why does that matter? So this is where we are now in this little experiment, which, by the way, it's not too long. Okay, we're getting closer to the end of it. Let's walk it through, and then we'll see what else there is to do. So other varieties of Zionist thought draw on intellectual traditions outside themselves, explicitly and by definition in the case of the first, second, and third political theory Zionisms, which bring political concepts from liberal, communist, and fascist political theories together with the political concept of Zionism. So Zionism as an idea already borrows from other political theories. That's clear. It is therefore already the case that at least some major varieties of Zionism draw, knowingly or not, explicitly or implicitly, directly or indirectly, on the deep philosophical foundations of the three political theories or ideologies. Okay, it's already happening that Zionist thought is indebted to liberal philosophy, communist philosophy, fascist philosophy, if you could call it that. Okay, it's already relying at some level on deep thinkers. You say, on what level? Well, for example, as I said, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but has quasi-constitutional basic laws. And these basic laws and their interpretation at the level of supreme jurisprudence in the country, it has to figure out, well, is Israel Jewish or democratic? And in reasoning through arguments like that, sometimes they have to invoke the authority of Kant. Sometimes they have to invoke the authority of somebody else. So they're already drawing on deep thinkers in order to do this act of self-interpretation, self-justification, and self-legitimation. Secondly, anti-Zionist rhetoric and analysis has deep philosophical foundations and resources at its disposal, and pro-Zionist rhetoric and analysis should be equipped to respond on the same plane. It shouldn't be the case, in my view, that you have theoretically sophisticated anti-Zionist political thought, and that the response to it should be theoretically unsophisticated. That doesn't seem right to me. It seems to me like if there are heavy-hitting thinkers making a case against peoplehood, against the sacrality of land, against whatever, okay, the power of a sovereign state, if there are serious theoretical resources among your opposing side, you have to rise to meet the challenge, I think. And so that's what I say in this point. Anti-Zionist rhetoric and analysis has sometimes deep philosophical foundations and resources at its disposal. Pro-Zionist rhetoric and analysis should be fully equipped to respond on the same plane. For instance, there are sophisticated postmodern philosophical tracts dedicated to the actual or ersatz philosophical critique of the political concept of Zionism, as well as to its practical implementation. So back when I was doing my dissertation research on Heidegger, which was published as my first book, beginning on Heidegger, I read a lot of these left Heideggerians who had sophisticated versions of their anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. You know, they were couching it in terms of ontology and metaphysics and deconstruction. And you're like, oh, okay, that's, let's call it theoretically sophisticated. All right, so there are sophisticated postmodern philosophical tracts that criticize the political concept of Zionism. Zionist analysis and rhetoric must understand and be able to respond to such critiques, which must be taken seriously. So somebody's going to disagree with me and say, you don't need to take Judith Butler seriously. You don't need to take some idiot political postmodernist seriously. You can just mock them. You can just dismiss them. You can just reject them. It's lame. That's not the approach that, for me anyways, makes the most sense. Yes, there's room for ridicule, needless to say, and often these authors make themselves ridiculous. But like I gave you earlier, if you were here earlier, the example of pagan imperialism, right? I showed you when he says our axiom is anti-Europe, anti-Christianity, anti-Semitism, anti-humanitarianism, anti-philosophy. You could say he makes it easy also, not to read him. But the reward is in the reading and the thinking. And the critics of Israel, the critics of the Jews, the critics of Zionism, I'm not saying everybody has to read their works, but at some level, there have to be people who engage with them and respond to them, who actually understand them and can offer a viable and a valuable criticism or alternative. So to repeat, Zionist analysis and rhetoric must understand and be able to respond to such critiques, which must be taken seriously. But the deepest foundation of the fourth political theory, according to Dugin, is Heidegger. Is Heidegger a good source for this task? So I'm saying take the fourth political theory, use it to understand Zionism. Part of the fourth political theory is an emphasis on Heidegger. Is Heidegger going to be useful in any way to this task? I say there are a few good reasons why he might be. First, it's not possible to understand the deconstructive philosophical arguments against Zionism without a basic familiarity with Heidegger and his students on the left. Okay, this is a generalization, but a lot of these postmodern, post-structuralist, leftist thinkers, however you want to categorize them, they are usually either immediately or a few steps removed, but nevertheless hugely influenced by Heidegger and the reception of Heidegger in France and on the left. So Heidegger looms large over French postmodernism. That's a fact. You may not know that fact, but that is a fact. I don't know how true it is now, but for sure it's as a generalization of decades, from the authors of the 70s, 80s, and so on, who continue to influence, let's say, left-leaning departments of sociology and all the rest of it. Heidegger looms large. Less so is there a familiarity with Heidegger's own works, but the impact of Heidegger on the left thinkers is a well-documented fact, and therefore the study of Heidegger is important in understanding those left postmodernists, many of whom are anti-Zionists. So that's like one link. Second, because the Heidegger of the fourth political theory is, unlike the Heidegger of the postmodern left, not merely destructive or deconstructive, but also positive, and the positive aspects are applicable as a radical hypothesis to the task of Zionist concept formation. I want to say something about this very quickly, which is this, that the way I formalized it for myself, and by the way, Dugin was my great teacher on this point. Maybe I would have discovered it eventually myself, maybe not, but I learned it from Dugin, which is that Heidegger has been interpreted by the left in the spirit of his criticism of metaphysics. So there's no such thing as truth with a capital T. There's no such thing as beauty with a capital B. There are no grand concepts. Everything is historically constituted. And once you see that, you can undo those apparently eternal concepts like truth, beauty, the good, justice. You can undo them. They no longer are eternal concepts. And you can see how they're constituted by narratives and discourses and power struggles. They're basically all contingent. So the left Heideggerians, they like this idea of the contingency, the radical contingency and radical relativity of all key concepts. And they work through that in a certain sort of way. And there is some evidence in Heidegger that they can marshal in support of their operations. But they're missing or deliberately suppressing a hugely important component of Heidegger's thought, which is that after the end of metaphysics, there is what he calls another beginning. Okay, I would show you the book, but I'm using it to prop up my laptop. Another beginning. Heidegger has several books on this topic: Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, another book called The Event, another book called Beyng, another one called On Inception. These are all books, Mindfulness. These are all books where Heidegger develops his view of another beginning of philosophy. What's after the end of metaphysics? And it's completely unlike what the left postmodernists talk about and think about, because for them, if you go that extra step with Heidegger, you'll probably just become a Nazi. It's too close for them to Nazism, so they stop at his destructive or deconstructive, let's say, phase. They stop where everything seems like it's been unraveled and historicized and made contingent, but they don't go the extra step. And Dugin, in his first Heidegger book, Martin Heidegger, the Philosophy of Another Beginning, he says, you must put this idea of another beginning at the center of your study of Heidegger. Don't even start with being in time. Don't start with Dasein. Start with the idea of another beginning. That's the key. Everything depends on that. By the way, I should say in some way, I'm convinced by Dugin's argument here, okay, after many years of reading and rereading Heidegger and Heideggerians and thinking all of this through. So to go back to the article here, okay, the Heidegger of the fourth political theory is unlike the Heidegger of the postmodern left, not merely deconstructive, but also positive, meaning this other element of another beginning of philosophy. And there could be elements of that suppressed Heidegger that are useful for Zionist concept formation. For instance, the following concepts in the Heideggerianism of the fourth political theory may prove relevant to the task at hand. Existential spatiality. Okay, that's in Being and Time. The Dasein of peoples. That's an idea that Dugin develops. The fourfold. Okay, das Gewährt. The existential plurality of Daseins, anticipation, resolution, destiny, language, being with. All of these deeply Heideggerian notions are really useful for understanding Jewish being in the world, and they may be useful for Zionist concept formation. Then I give an example, point 34. Consider, for instance, Fagenblatt. Okay, he's an Israeli scholar who writes about Heidegger at times from this perspective. Consider his assessment. Access to the political provided by Heidegger is especially acute with respect to the Jewish theological political imaginary that prevails in and around the state of Israel today. Heidegger's political ontology, he writes, provides an immense resource for a philosophical elucidation of the Jewish political imaginary in Israel. Yeah, I agree. I fully agree. Heidegger, which I'm sure I'm going to say in the article, despite being a Nazi, despite whatever issues he had with the Jews, some well documented, and despite the fact that so many Heideggerians are leftists who don't like Israel and offer deconstructive approach to all of these things, despite all of that, Heidegger actually proves to be an extremely useful resource for elaborating the political concept of the Jewish imaginary or the Jewish self-understanding in the context of Zionist statehood. So again, the title of this presentation, of this YouTube presentation, right, of this video is How to Study Controversial Thinkers. And the example here is, even though everything is set up to make you think that it would be a mistake to apply Heidegger to the Jewish issue in a positive way, because it's like Heideggerians are anti-Semites, Heidegger was an anti-Semite, all of these different reasons you can adduce, still it's like, well, hold on a minute, let's just think it through. Having read Heidegger, we see that there are so many notions that actually help us to understand Zionism. So even though all the forces are arrayed against this, our independent thoughtfulness shows us that, maybe there's something there. But for that, you need two things. You need the serious study of these authors and ideas, and you need kind of the willingness to think against the grain where it's necessary. Even you have to think against the grain of the followers of a controversial thinker sometimes. You might think like, I'm against the grain because I'm reading a controversial thinker. Yeah, that's true. You are. Because if you weren't, you wouldn't be reading a controversial thinker. You're against the grain. But as you read that controversial thinker, there's also an opportunity to go against the grain. Against the grain maybe sometimes of his followers or of himself or of other ideas that are related or implied. So at every step, you have to be self-possessed and have the determination and the courage to think the matter through. You might make mistakes, but that's how you learn. So let's go back to this article here. So I told you this assessment of this Israeli scholar that Heidegger's political ontology provides an immense resource for philosophical elucidation of the Jewish political imaginary in Israel. Unexpected but interesting result. However, the same concepts might also be used to anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic ends, as it is sometimes claimed happened in the case of even the positive Heidegger. So just because Heidegger's inceptual thinking or thinking of the philosophy of another beginning might be useful for Zionist concept formation, it might also be the opposite. There are many people who do read Heidegger's other beginning thinking who still believe that, sometimes because Heidegger gave them evidence to think this, they still believe that Jews are the cause of, the destruction of the world. So it's like, okay, it doesn't guarantee you, right, that there are no pitfalls. But the same is true of other political theories and philosophies, right? So Jews who profit from liberal political theory, they must know that there are liberals who are anti-Semites and anti-Zionists, but it doesn't matter. You just have to work it through. You have to think it through. You can't lump everything into the same big soup. All right, so we're almost done this, I think. Yeah, that was the last point. I also have a bunch of footnotes here. So you can see, for example, that last thing I quoted was this article of Dwelling Prophetically on Heidegger and Jewish Political Theology. And then I have other citations here that, elaborate parts of the argument. So let's see what this one is. For instance, this is on Heidegger from a book on Heidegger called Reading Heidegger's Black Notebooks. Let's see what the quote is. In spite of his anti-Semitism, it turns out that Heidegger cannot properly be read other than in a way that takes account of what might even be said to be the pro-Semitic character of key elements within that thinking. And one cannot be sure what Heidegger might have thought about the interconnection between his own thought and Judaic thought. That's another point that's often overlooked. People who don't really know this topic well, they say, how can you study Heidegger? Heidegger was a Nazi. Yes, Heidegger was a Nazi. Clearly, that does not mean that we shouldn't study him. But it also overlooks the fact that many of his most careful and many of his most loving readers were Jews. And I can tell you, as somebody who teaches Heidegger in private tutoring often, and often with Jews, that, yeah, there's a lot of pro-Semitic elements in Heidegger's thought that clearly he himself was oblivious to, but that other people have picked up on. So okay, what have we done, right? We went over this little experimental paper. It's called An Experiment in Jewish Heideggerianism, Zionism, and the Fourth Political Theory, combining a set of controversial topics, okay? Fourth political theory is controversial, Zionism is controversial, Jewish Heideggerianism is controversial. But how do you study a controversial topic? Carefully, okay? Carefully. Don't be a hothead about it. Don't be too quick to reject or too quick to accept. Don't fall in love with controversy for the sake of controversy. Don't think that just because you're going against the grain, you're like, I'm not one of the sheep, I'm going against the grain. But then all the other people who went against the grain, they become the new sheep sometimes. So it doesn't excuse you from the effort of having to think through what's right, what's wrong, what makes sense, what doesn't, what's interesting, even if it's not exact, what's useful, and all of that. So I've been holding up this book because I'm also reading it at the same time, Pagan Imperialism, and there are many examples of that in this book. And there are others. There's always something you can be learning from. I feel bad in a way for, this is Moses Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. I feel bad for people who we're not going to read Maimonides because somewhere he said one thing that we found distasteful, or we're just not going to read him because he's Jewish and we don't like Jews, or for some other reason. There's so much you can learn. You read things that you can learn from. You don't just read books you agree with. You read books that you have reason to believe you can learn from. I don't know. I guess one kind of life is just reading what you already know you're fully going to agree with. But I don't see where the full potential of education lies in that model. The beautiful thing is, in order to have something to think about, you need to read and consider positions, arguments, perspectives that don't all agree with one another. Anyway, everybody has the temptation, myself included, obviously. Okay, I don't exclude myself from any of these criticisms or any of these dangers of just reading what confirms what you already believe, or your niche gets so narrowed down that you completely forgot about the world outside. You get enclosed in a bubble. And then we have all of our personal inclinations that color what we read and how we read it, what we see, what we don't see, how we see it. That goes without saying. I'm predisposed to have a positive interpretation of Israel, just as some of you are predisposed to have a negative interpretation of Israel. And yet it takes some effort to think things through. I'm predisposed to have a positive attitude towards philosophical supremacists. And at times I have to remind myself that, there are those people who say you can learn more from literature than you can learn from philosophy. And I have to take their arguments seriously too, even though I tend to believe that literature at its best is roughly equivalent to philosophy at its worst. Not exactly, but I've always thought that, let's say, a great literary premise, it needs characters and places, and you describe, all the 20 shades of green that you saw on the way to the walk and the sounds of the birds chirping. But really, the idea of a book can be distilled. You can find the idea in some book that needs 1,000 pages for the literary presentation in 1 page of philosophy. So I always thought, why don't you just go straight to the philosophy? If you're interested in the idea, go to the pure presentation of it in a philosophical context. And literature shines in the reflected light, or it borrows the light of philosophy. It doesn't have its own sort of grandeur. That's what I used to think, but I'm always open to the challenge. I have a nice friend. In fact, I interviewed him on this channel once. I've only interviewed a few people. He was one of them, Kenji Hayakawa, who largely on the basis of his love of James Joyce, used to tell me that literature has an independent value. And it was Richard Rorty, a philosopher that I don't really like and I'm not really attracted to, but I still learned from and give credit to. It was Richard Rorty who convinced me in one of his essays. And Richard Rorty is not, I would say, a philosophical supremacist. He's the only author in my Heidegger book that I'm sort of like, that I don't like for that reason. He sees philosophy as just another form of literature, basically. But he convinced me that literature has this independent merit, that it develops our empathy towards other human beings in a way that philosophy does not do, which I think is true. If you read about certain characters and then you walk out onto the street, you may see the people on the street like those characters. You may just understand the inner lives of people more. You may become more empathetic reading literature. I don't think that philosophy necessarily has that intention, even though I think political philosophy can make you a better citizen, can make you a better friend, can make you a better parent, a better child. Political philosophy can improve you, but I think it's true that literature does something special for human empathy. Again, I give that as an example of something that I did not want to recognize, the independent worth of literature vis-a-vis philosophy, but that I forced myself to recognize. It doesn't always work. When it comes to music, I've had a lot of people tell me that Björk is a genius, and every couple of years I listen to Björk and I can't do it. I don't see the genius. I don't like the music. I even tried to watch some movie on Björk where she plays a blind whatever. I don't know if you know that movie. I think it's Lars von Trier is the director. I couldn't get into it. I don't understand Björk. I don't like Björk. And nevertheless, I try every couple of years. So what are cases for you, or something that you did not, you were dead set against it, and then you came around to it, or you thought it must be wrong, but the closer you looked, the more it seemed plausible? Or by contrast, something that people tell you, you have to give it a chance, you are giving it a chance, and it's just not clicking. Björk is my example for that. Okay, so I had a bunch of other stuff queued up. We just went over to repeat an experiment in Jewish Heideggerianism, Zionism, and the fourth political theory to show you how I personally reasoned through, in what is obviously an experiment. Okay, an experiment. So I thought it ended up being pretty useful. I learned some things from it that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. Hopefully it was good for you too. So I do have some other articles, and most of them, to tell you the truth, are on the Jewish topic. I kind of have that on my mind. I know some of you may have that on your mind, given what's going on over the last year, both the attack on Israel and then Israel's operations in Gaza and now in Lebanon. So maybe we'll read this, maybe not. Let me just show you what I had queued up. A King in Israel. This is an article in First Things magazine from about 14 years ago, May 2010. But it's related in a way to what we've been talking about. It's an experimental argument about having an Israeli monarchy, like an Israeli messianic monarchy. So I thought, okay, that could be interesting, just from the point of view of pure political theory. I haven't read it yet. I thought we could read it together. Then on more contemporary events, there's an article in Tablet magazine called Killing Nasrallah. Okay, this is probably from a slightly neoconservative perspective, taking Israel's operations as something that America should emulate. Okay, I thought that could be interesting to read. I haven't read it yet. And then maybe we'll do this one just to lighten the mood. First, I saw this article circulating in Newsweek, How Hot Girls Became the Right's New Obsession, which I told you, why is everything normal called fascist? Well, people being attracted to attractive people seems pretty normal, doesn't it? Not the kind of thing that needs to have a deep analysis. Why are people attracted to attractive people? Well, okay, how hot girls became the right's new obsession. I saw that circulating. I thought it could be funny to read. So what do you think? Let me see. Is there anything you'd like to do or not do together? Let's see. We're an hour in. I didn't know that the article on Jewish Heideggerianism would take so long to go through. It's good to see everybody here. Sorry that I haven't been keeping up with the comments in the chat. Let's just maybe take a look at that. So I'm Israeli and interested in Dugin, but interested how you settle his thought. Do I hold there's a Jewish polarity or Israeli polarity? So yeah, the question, Dugin has a multipolar model of international relations where the poles are civilizations. So we'd have to start there. Dugin's theory of a multipolar world, which I translated, is available in English. And the task would be to take the notions that he has set forth in that work, Theory of Multipolar World, and see, can we apply them to Israel and to Israel's place in the world? And some of that we'd have to think through. Israel's relation with Russia, how much it depends on the United States, what's the character of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and when does Israel act independently of U.S. pressure, which I think that article on Nasrallah that I have pulled up from Tablet Magazine discusses that a little bit, I believe. So that's kind of how we'd have to do the analysis. But if you want to know about Dugin's thoughts on multipolarity, probably the first place to look to from a theoretical point of view is Theory of a Multipolar World, which it's not a book in Russian. It's actually a chapter in a book. Dugin, when he taught at Moscow State University, he used to teach international relations, and he wrote a textbook on international relations theory. Most of it just covers your typical schools of international relations theory, like realism, neorealism, liberalism, neoliberalism, the English school, and so on. But the 5th chapter of his book, I believe it was, discussed his specific contribution to the field, Theory of a Multipolar World, and that's what I translated. Some other comments here. It seems to me that Jews in exile were not a united thing. Fragmentation in Israeli society. Yeah, I don't know, the people who talk about Jews online and who talk about Zionists online tend to lump them all together. I don't know how much they know about the domestic situation, the different kinds of groups in Israel. And there was nearly a civil war before October 7th over the idea of judicial reform. What is the Jewish state? I told you they don't have a constitution. They have open questions that haven't been resolved. And sometimes there's a lot of pressure among the different Jewish groups to resolve that question. So there are a lot of details, the Ethiopian Jews, the Druze, and all these other sub-communities, how they all get along together, how they all interpret the world together. So it's a complicated society. Cosmos writes, I'm currently reading Bap, Costa, and Alamario. I've found this seductive effect quite strong. I've certainly had to consciously ask myself, what do I really think about this many times? Yeah, there are authors, like Nietzsche is one of them for sure. I think Bap is one of them. There are others who they can really lure you in with their rhetoric, which is designed to do that at times. And yeah, we sometimes have to have a reality check where we snap ourselves out and say, wait. Okay, that maybe was like beautifully stated or extremely compelling, but do I fully agree? Does he mean what I think he means? Who's got a counterpoint and that sort of thing? Okay, Cosmos also says, I think the emphasis on the seductive nature of the controversial is quite apt, seeing as I have never felt this way while reading, for instance, Rawls or Bentham for university. Yeah. There's something like anodyne about the mainstream, and there's something alluring about the controversial. And that's okay, forbidden fruit and all the rest of it, but you have to remember the pitfalls. And knowing the pitfalls, we can guard against them to a certain extent. So New Prater, the mentalist, says anti-Europe, and that was a reference to this passage in Evola's Pagan Imperialism, where he says, the axiom of the teaching of this book is anti-Europe, anti-philosophy, which again, keep in mind, I told you, I'm a philosophical supremacist. So when an author says he's anti-philosophy, I'm ready to toss the book out the window. But obviously you have to fight the urge and continue to read to see what there is to learn. But yeah, anti-Europe, because he sees modern Europe or contemporary Europe as degenerate. Okay. Hold on a second. Yeah, so other comments. Okay, a chart for where Evola's book should be placed. I think I saw that once on archive.org. This is with reference to the idea that pagan imperialism is not Evola's last word, and you sort of have to see how it fits in with his other teachings. Okay, some other comments. Sorry, I didn't go over to the chat as I was reading that Jewish Heideggerianism experiment. I appreciate all the comments. I'm glad you guys are here. Hopefully you're finding this interesting. So let's go over to, well, let me just a quick check here. Would you rather cover, I have time maybe for one or two more articles. We've got Killing Nasrallah, which is obviously very topical. We have A King in Israel, an older, more theoretical argument about the possibility of like a messianic monarchy in Israel. And we have this kind of lighthearted Hot Girls, Sydney Sweeney, Haley Welch. I think, why don't we leave this Hot Girls off to the side? And even though it's probably pretty funny, And not just funny. I mean, we don't read these articles just because they're funny. It's obviously going to be insightful too. I mean, if you have to raise the question, why are people attracted to attractive people, then you know that somewhere you've strayed so far from an ordinary understanding of human nature that you have to raise questions about, like, why do people breathe? Why do people blink? Which is okay too. All right, fine, let's read this. In March, the 27-year-old actress hosted Saturday Night Live. Oh, sorry, this is Sydney Sweeney they're talking about. It all began with Sydney Sweeney's cleavage. In March, the 27-year-old actress hosted Saturday Night Live for the first time, wearing low-cut outfits during the start and close of the show, which featured a number of jokes about her physical appearance, including a sketch where she played a Hooters waitress. SNL cast member Bowen Yang revealed in a recent episode of the Fly on the Wall podcast that the Euphoria star was practically begging everybody to make body-related jokes. She came in and was like, "Please, everyone, make jokes about my boobs," he said. At the time, Sweeney's appearance sparked much discourse and was lauded by a number of right-wing commentators as the death of woke. The actress had become a so-called conservative hot girl, a pinup for the modern-day right-wing movement, as it attempts to expand the appeal of conservatism beyond the confines of its largely older white male base. I'll just stop here for a minute about the older white male base. I saw in the Canadian case, okay, it's probably different in the United States, but in the Canadian case where we have Prime Minister Trudeau, he's like our Kamala Harris, okay? He's like our Joe Biden. He's our inept, corrupt destroyer of all things good. So he is on its last legs, okay? Trudeau's about to get tossed out. His Liberal Party is just faring historically badly in the recent polls, and apparently the Conservatives are going to win a crushing supermajority when we do have our next election. And what I saw is that there's a lot of support in the younger demographic for Pierre Poilievre. Among 18 to 30-something year olds is like his strongest constituency. So I don't know about the United States, but in the case of Canada, it's not true that the right-wing movement and its conservatism is confined primarily to an older white male base. I think there's a younger, now conservative base. But let's continue with the article. Sweeney and other conservative hot girls don't necessarily have any tangible involvement with politics, though some have strong political affiliations, but they have been claimed by right-wing public figures as their own, whether they appear to like it or not. I think I remember a time before Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris, where when she was silent about politics, people, very online people, were like, yeah, she's secretly like an Aryan and stuff like that. I don't know whether you remember that. Those days are long gone. So you have these conservative hot girls, okay? Who is the conservative hot girl? It's like a Socratic question. Who is the conservative hot girl? The conservative hot girl isn't a particularly new phenomenon, Victoria Cann, an associate professor at the University of East Anglia in the UK, told Newsweek. Women have been positioned through the lens of the masculinist energy in conservative populist politics for a very long time. Sweeney appears to have kicked off the latest wave of conservative hot girls at a time when conventional beauty standards have been adopted as a purported antidote to wokeness. Let me just ask here the general question. Does this line up that, woke equals ugly and conservative equals beauty, or that the defense of conventional beauty standards is a right-wing or conservative response to the unconventional, artificial ugliness and, I'll say, however you want to characterize it, of the left? The word woke was originally associated with progressive movements, but has since been co-opted by conservative critics to mock what they perceive as excessive political correctness, virtue signaling, or a tendency to overemphasize identity politics. So on one hand, this is like a frivolous issue, right? Oh, conservatives, they saw Sydney Sweeney on Saturday Night Live. She's big and busty and beautiful. And, wow, this is like conservative hot girl phenomenon. Okay, we're going to read the article. It might sound trivial, but there are elements to this that are serious, which is, I've been discussing Plato's Symposium in private tutoring, and we sometimes, Plato's Symposium is speeches to Eros, the god or not the god, depending on who you ask, of the people in the symposium, the god or not god, of love and longing, desire, Eros. So, the erotic is a topic of political concern, the erotic, love, lust, crimes of lust, okay? Beauty, more generally, independently of sexual eroticism, right? Beauty, is it demoralizing to have ugly sculpture and ugly architecture? Is it demoralizing to live in a city that's ugly? What is beauty when it comes to art, architecture, other forms of public presence and manifestation, including people's bodies, characters, personalities, including what they say and how they say it? So the topic of eroticism and the topic of beauty, they belong to the history of political philosophy. You may know a nice documentary, I think it's called What is Beauty? By Roger Scruton. You can look that up and take a look. So beauty in general and beautiful people, more specifically, the issue of beauty, it's clearly belongs in the realm of political teaching. And then my last video on Plato's Laws, I told you there's a great discussion on the problem of young men full of sperm and their erotic longings and the crimes that can sometimes produce, and so on. So let's go back here. This was just me telling you that this is maybe a frivolous-ish topic, but it has some deeper dimensions to it. So, okay, Amy Tatum of Bournemouth University told Newsweek that this focus on hot girls is a way for the right in the US to fight back against perceptions of wokeness. Holding up women in a sexualized fashion could be a tactic to reinforce gender stereotypes around women's appearances. Okay, so there you go. That's Sydney Sweeney, 2024 Vanity Fair Oscar party. Following Sweeney's appearance on SNL, right-wing political commentator Richard Hanania, and we've read some of his stuff on this channel, in particular his article on the tech right. So right-wing political commentator Richard Hanania shared a clip of the actress on the show in a low-cut dress with the caption, "Wokeness is dead." An opinion piece in Canada's National Post asked, are Sydney Sweeney's breasts double D harbingers of the death of woke? I have to say, on one hand, I feel sorry for us that we live in a time when a newspaper could print something like that. It's just kind of, this is where the Evola in me kicks in, is like, yes, this is all decline, this is all decay, this is all degeneration. Like, but okay, an opinion piece in Canada's National Post asked, are Sydney Sweeney's breasts double D harbingers of the death of woke? The author of that piece, Amy Ham, wrote that Sweeney knows she's admired and owns her sex appeal with zero apologies, arguing that today's diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates have discouraged admiration of beauty due to its exclusivity, implying that exclusion equals to hate. Remember, I told you in my most viewed video of all time, I think, why is everything normal called fascist? Oh, you're attracted to a beautiful person? You are a fascist, right? Because not everybody's beautiful, therefore you're exclusionary. Like, you must only be attracted to ugly people. That's what socialism requires. Actually, this is an old topic too. You should know that there are comedies written thousands of years ago on this topic by Aristophanes, for instance. The idea is like, you know, a man can marry a beautiful woman, but only if he sleeps with an ugly old hag first, because that's equality. Okay, that sort of thing. So this is an age-old topic. Okay, how could you put it? The resentment of the ugly against the beautiful, not just the resentment of the weak against the strong. We aren't supposed to admire Sweeney's beauty, but we've done it anyways, she added. The point was echoed by Inez Felcher-Stepman, senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum and self-proclaimed anti-feminist. Men don't only like Sydney Sweeney for her boobs, they like her because she's the first starlet in a long time to unrepentantly and cheerfully chase the male gaze, Stepman wrote on X after Sweeney's SNL debut. She's clearly giving permission to ogle and enjoying that feminine power, an oasis for men in a nut vice culture, lol. Okay, allow me to get like squirrel brain distracted here. But speaking of Oasis, is anybody going to their concerts in North America or Europe? Let me know. I put my name in the hat to get tickets. I think they go tomorrow for the Toronto show. Okay, an oasis for men in a nut vice culture. In early August, Sweeney posted a series of photos to Instagram with the caption, I think they call this a thirst trap. Okay, so she's a young, beautiful woman who enjoys being young and beautiful. She enjoys the attention of men looking at her, and apparently this is a right-wing phenomenon. The sports commentator Joe Kinsey later shared the images on X with the caption, it's a bad week to be a militant blue-haired lesbian, in a thread of messages that also included posts about university sororities. Why Sweeney? She's conventionally attractive and popular, and although the actress has never publicly discussed her political leanings, an event for her mother's 60th birthday in 2022 caused a whirlwind of speculation. Pictures from the party circulated online of guests wearing hats that said, Make 60 great again, in the style of Trump's Make America Great Again. Oh no, you know what that means. Must mean that she's a fascist. Sweeney responded at the time telling people to stop making assumptions and wrote on X that an innocent celebration for my mom's milestone 60th birthday has turned into an absurd political statement, which was not the intention. Newsweek has reached out to Sweeney for comment. That's ridiculous. And then here's Haley Welch. Sweeney isn't the only young woman getting the conservative hot girl treatment. Haley Welch, better known as the Hawktua girl, shot to fame in June after she appeared in a TikTok interview in which she offered sex advice. When asked by the interviewer, what's one move in bed that makes a man go crazy every time? Welch replied, you got to give him that Hawktua and spit on that thing. Okay, sorry that I had to read that out loud, but there you go. Hawktua is the sound someone makes while spitting. The 22-year-old from Tennessee has no obvious link to any political party, but this hasn't seemed to matter. The top comment on an Instagram post of Welch's where she's posing in a red, white, and star-spangled cowboy hat for the 4th of July reads, we did it, internet, we finally made the right person famous. And okay, well, they post a post of hers, but they don't post the one that they just mentioned. I wanted to see whether right is capitalized, whether it's like, ooh. Anyway, her Hawktua catchphrase has been adopted by conservatives and put on merch that's similar to former President Donald Trump's and is emblazoned over an American flag. And I saw recently she's got like the 3rd leading podcast in America behind Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. So yeah, people really wanted to hear her talk, I guess. Merch of this style with the catchphrase Hawktua 24 printed in red and white on a blue or black backdrop is also sold by Welch's official merchandise store. Writing in Newsweek about her newfound fame, Welch said, all the opportunities created by the viral clip are new for me, and I'm learning along the way. So I hope people give me a little patience and forgiveness because I'm going to slip up. Seems innocent enough. Newsweek has reached out to Welch for comment. Victoria Cann of the University of East Anglia said, Sydney Sweeney and Haley Welch have actively distanced themselves from those right-wing politics, but have nevertheless become entangled within them because of what they represent, not what they actually think. There are women in the conservative hot girl bracket who actively engage in right-wing politics. That list includes Republican National Committee National Spokeswoman Elizabeth Pipko and Republican Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna. Right-wing and right-leaning media outlets, rather than commentators online, seem to have been behind these women's conservative hot girl labels. I also saw, I think you saw too, maybe those of you who are too online, some TikTok compilation of German women, young German women singing like AfD, Alternative for Deutschland theme song. And it was like, oh, look at this. Hot young German women are now supporting the right. What are you going to do, right? People in politics, you're not going to force people in politics not to be attracted to attractive women. Anyways, Pipko, who the New York Post described as the MAGA-loving bikini model who is the GOP's sexiest new spokeswoman, told Newsweek that I don't think about my looks as much as I think about learning to embrace and love every part of who I am. I'm proud to try and wake up and do that every day, and more importantly, to inspire other young people around the country to do the same, politics aside. Luna made headlines back in August after a nearly decade-old video of her wearing a MAGA swimsuit resurfaced. The Daily Mail described her as a MAGA bombshell. In response to the video, the Florida lawmaker said on X, I'm confirming I have indeed worn swimsuits, and you can tell I am biologically a woman. I mean, it's kind of weird, isn't it? I told you, like, the topic of erotic attraction, it belongs in thinking about political life and human life. Probably the most statement about it ever written is the speech of Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium, where Aristophanes describes that we were originally circular beings, we're split, and now we're searching for our other half, really capturing the erotic longing of one human being for another. Sometimes in Aristophanes' presentation heterosexually, sometimes homosexually, but people longing for another, longing for the other, longing for completion that they can never really fully attain for reasons that Plato writes in Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium. So erotic longing and attraction is an exalted topic. It's also sociologically important. People talk about declining birth rates and why aren't people having children? Why is OnlyFans making more money than the National Basketball Association? I think I saw that, right? The payouts for performers on OnlyFans was higher than the payouts for all of the members of the NBA combined. So all of these issues are hugely important socially, not to mention that the transgender, right? You should not identify with normal sexual or health identities or standards. All of this is in play. And yet it does seem kind of ridiculous to have to discuss it. which is the weird thing. This episode prompted Ginger Gates, the wife of Luna Fellows Florida Republican Matt Gates, to share various images of conservative women on X, including a photo of Republican Lauren Boebert in a bikini. Sorry if I mispronounced her name. So the idea here is like, if you're a beautiful woman and you're a conservative, that's weird, I guess. Because it's like, are you exploiting your beauty for political purposes or what? Why should it be weird that there are beautiful women who are conservatives and that there are conservative men who love beautiful women? I don't really get it. Unless the thing is like the left, we've identified the left. Left equals woke. Woke equals anti-beauty. War on beauty. Cacocracy, the rule of the ugly. Okay. There's something titillating about seeing a beautiful young woman spouting right-wing slogans. Catherine Rottenberg of Goldsmiths, University of London, told Newsweek in describing this as saying F you to feminists and other progressives. She added that's an attempt to show they're fighting wokeness. By the way, you've seen articles about men too, like men who are trying to become attractive by going to the gym and getting jacked, they all become fascists. You've seen articles like that. Pipko responded, I don't consider myself someone who spouts anything but pro-American slogans, and I'm very proud of that. She described this criticism as being made by people who are confused or so blinded by their hatred for those who hold differing political views that they forget what being a feminist actually means. Some people are considered conventionally beautiful, but when you have a pattern where hot girls are the faces of the movement, and when they're using tropes, bikini shots, as a way of sending a particular kind of message, then that feels extremely regressive, Rottenberg said. Oh, come on, Rottenberg. Get off it with that nonsense. She added, I am all for having lots of smart, articulate, and good-looking women as spokespeople for movements, but we need a wide range of faces, ages, and body shapes. Well, I can't, if they're, okay. You understand for yourselves without me needing to comment. Conservative hot girls have one thing in common besides implied or explicit political values, according to Aaron Casses of the University of Delaware. I mean, it is funny. I'm sorry. I'm reading this. I try to be pretty serious and I try to have this channel be pretty serious. This article is just kind of ridiculous. We'll make of it what we can. These aren't just hot women, they're white women, she told Newsweek. It's a narrow and conventional definition of sex appeal or hotness. It runs counter to cultural change, reflecting an expansion of beauty standards to be more inclusive in terms of body size, race, and ethnicity, for example. So if you have a white woman in a bikini and she's blonde, you are a fascist. If you have, diverse fat people, then you are okay. If you have non-diverse, non-fat people, then you are not okay. This is basic, you know that, right? This is your worldview interpretation at play here, really, right? I'll give you an example. I went to see the movie Megalopolis. I read the reviews for it first, which were pretty much uniformly horrible. The movie itself, I won't tell you what I thought about, but after I watched it, I saw a review in a Canadian, in The Guardian. I saw a review in The Guardian. And one of the things it said is, this is the least egalitarian movie. Something like, this is the least egalitarian movie I've ever seen. Okay, like the only time it shows the people is if they're like stinky, rotten gutter filth, or if they're doing some sort of mass protest. So it doesn't really depict the people and their suffering. It just depicts kind of the great men and their concerns. So it said, I'm quoting almost exactly here from memory, it's the least egalitarian movie I've ever seen. So if all you knew about Megalopolis was that it's the least egalitarian movie this person has ever seen, well, for some people, it's going to be like, yes, that's great. That's amazing. This is my new favorite movie, even if I've never seen it, because it's about time that we had something that's non-egalitarian. And for other people, it's going to be like, oh, no, that's horrible. It must be terrible because, we have to represent the diversity of people's concerns and interests. You can't just focus on powerful men. That's sexist and racist and exclusionary and bigoted and all of that. So same thing here, like he's a beautiful woman, boom, automatically it's going to divide. Oh, unless she's like fat, ugly, and neurodivergent, then this must be fascism. That's all this is. The focus on the conservative hot girl comes at a time when the political gender divide in America is wider than ever. A poll previously conducted for Newsweek found that more men, 26%, have become more conservative than women, 19%. Slightly more women, 18%, have become more liberal than men, 17%. The Pew Research Center released an analysis in April, which showed that Republicans tend to skew older than Democrats. 2/3 of voters ages 18 to 24 associated with the Democratic Party. So this is the difference with Canada, I think, now with the young swinging conservative here, with the largest Republican voter demographic being over 80. Goldsmith's Catherine Rottenberg said, like advertisements that sell objects by objectifying women and their bodies, this seems to be a similar strategy. Attractive women are good for business. Yeah, no doubt that's true. By having hot young women as their icons, multiple messages are sent. By the way, you know, Bronze Age Pervert used to advertise his book, Bronze Age Mindset, by having pictures of, you know, bikini-clad women holding it, reading it on the beach. Maybe some user-generated content there, maybe not, I don't know. By having hot young women as their icons, multiple messages are sent that if you align yourself with the movement, you will be able to hang in the company of these gorgeous young things, that the movement attracts attractive people and not just old white men, she said. So yeah, that's a point, right? Sex sells. You want to make it cool to be Republican. How do you make it cool to be Republican? Be a Republican and you can... I was going to say bang a hot chick, but let's not put it that way. The Republican Party is predominantly male. The Center for American Women in Politics reported that in 2024, around 16% of Republican nominees for the U.S. House of Representatives are women. This is lower than the Democratic Party, where nearly 46% of the nominees are women. Cassese said that the conservative hot girl is a way of appealing to other men on the basis of the male gaze. Attractiveness and power have always gone hand in hand. The presence of hot girls makes conservatism look appealing. She added that this is coinciding with reports that conservative men are struggling on dating apps. Yeah, you know what? This is another thing. Like in Canada, when Trudeau won, which is too bad that he ever did, and then he did it again and again, which is even worse. But when Trudeau first won, there were many people who voted for him because they thought he was cute or hot, you know? And Stephen Harper was like old and gray-haired and stodgy. So it's like, ooh, you know, Justin Trudeau, ooh, let's vote for the kind of hot, young, good-looking guy. This is what people who voted in our election thought in some cases. Okay, I know this firsthand from people who have said so. Oh, he's cute. He's got nice hair. So, you know, you had your liberal hot guy phenomenon where it's like going to replace Stephen Harper with Justin Trudeau because he's a sex symbol. Okay, well, it's just what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Now you get the hot woman, conservative hot women. Who cares? It's all pretty stupid, isn't it? But that's the thing. It's stupid, but it's not trivial. It is a huge part of, you know, it's an issue, right? It's an issue. Relationships, marriage, hooking up, dating culture, childbirth, incels, from women who can't find a man to marry, all these ideologies that are convincing people not to bring children into the world. Like it is all a serious topic, even though somehow it's all ridiculous. So the conservative hot girl is a way of appealing to other men on the basis of the male gaze and so on. And that's something. So what does this say about American conservatism? Does the conservative hot girls rise? By the way, if you are on this stream and you're a conservative hot girl, feel free to introduce yourself. Does the conservative hot girls rise symbolize a more liberal thinking about sexuality, or is it the installation of women as objects for political gain? Definitely the latter, Rottenberg said. There's no liberal thinking about sexuality here. What is liberal thinking about sexuality? Is women, transgender women, and anyway. Patriarchy and populism go hand in hand. Hannah Yellen of Oxford Brookes University in England told Newsweek, policing women, their appearance and their bodies is an integral mechanism of the American right. Can said that the women involved in this movement, who actually readily align themselves with right-wing populism, oftentimes represent a profound interest in traditional gender norms and an explicit rejection of feminist politics. Cassese points to the fact that the reification of the hot girl is coinciding with the erosion of women's reproductive rights, and that this points to a regressive tendency to prioritize men's sexual gratification over women's agency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The University of Delaware academic added, the hot girl is the opposite of the childless cat lady being invoked by leaders like J.D. Vance. These two competing images of womanhood arising in conservative rhetoric are two sides of the same coin, and they say a lot about what conservatives value about women. All right, well, I guess that wasn't that good, was it? But we read things to give us something to think about. So is there anything to that? The conservative hot girl phenomenon, is that just completely... I mean, it's, as I said, obviously there's something there, right? If you take the idea of completely veiling a woman because you don't want her to be seen as a sexual object. Take the case of a woman who feels empowered when she's seen as a sexual being. You know, all of these sorts of things, they do have political ramifications, how you interpret masculinity, femininity, and all the rest of it, but branding it as the conservative hot girl phenomenon is pretty ridiculous. Maybe Richard Hanania's article is worth reading. I think that's the one where it's like Sydney Sweeney's boobs have refuted wokeism, but we're not going to do that. So let me pause for a minute and see. This is an uncharacteristically long live stream, and I still had a couple of things queued up that we could read. Let's see where we are in the comments here. Let me just go up through the comments. So thank you, Naaman3. Glad you like the work. What do we have here? So good thing we have professors studying the important phenomenon of conservative hot girls. Future assured. Yes. I wanted, some of you may want to do a 5-year research program on conservative hot girls, but you really have to make sure that you know the literature well, and in particular, you do like an exhaustive study of all the conservative hot girls, cross-cultural study, because you should know the German conservative hot girls, the Italian conservative hot girls, the Spanish conservative hot girls. So some of you who are looking for a research project, now that you know that there are professors studying conservative hot girls, maybe you'll find your calling. Oh, I got to tell you, there's a dialogue of Plato's on beauty. I can never remember whether it's the greater Hippias or the lesser Hippias, okay? But it's a conversation Socrates has with the sophist named Hippias. I teach this in my course on the roots of political philosophy at millermanschool.com, but I'm just going to tell you one part of it here, which is that Socrates engages this person Hippias in the question, what is the beautiful? What is the beautiful? And Hippias is not really on Socrates' level. He doesn't know what kind of answer Socrates is looking for. And he gives my favorite wrong answer in all of Plato, which is that Socrates asks him, what is the beautiful? And Hippias says, oh, that's easy, Socrates. The beautiful is a beautiful maiden. Okay? The beautiful is a beautiful young woman, which is wrong, as Socrates goes to show you, but it's the best wrong answer in all of Plato. It's the truest wrong answer in all of Plato. It's the funniest and most classic wrong answer. So yes, they're against beauty because they fear Plato. Well, it's when you introduce beauty, you got to remember the Republic, in Plato's Republic, the city in speech, the just city, is called Kallipolis. Kalos is beautiful. Okay, so the beautiful city. The question of beauty is a question. Beauty like genius, like strength, like excellence seems to be exclusionary, Many things are beautiful, but not everything is beautiful. Not everything is beautiful in the same way. Cosmos writes, what did we see here? Both are ugly. I guess that he means both of the women discussed in that article, maybe. Conservatives would view the pursuit of the vital cultivation of the body as too materialistic, pagan, immoral. Liberals would say it promotes natural inequality and hierarchy. Beauty standards are conservative, Ego Emmy says. The left is about bringing the marginalized into the center, so the ugly gains while beautiful things are oppressive. Liberalism's inverse morality, in which the ugly and weak are not only made equal, but promoted as the ideal, is not shared by conservatives, so perhaps conservatism could be considered less ugly. Okay. And then, yes, Midnight Sun writes from Evola and Dugan to this. Yes. Ego Ami, Lizzo or bust. Yes. So we have that. Okay. And let's go here. So now, look, this is a long live stream and we're moving from topic to topic, but we're doing it. So you might as well do it. It's like, if you want to go to the gym, you've been putting it off, then you get there. If you're in the gym, you might as well work out. Okay, we're on this live stream. We might as well go over another article. So we're back to the topic of Israel. And I do want to preface this by a few things. Number one, I haven't read this article. I'm reading it with you here together. It was recommended to me. Okay, so we're going to read it together. The other thing is that, like with my Zionism, the Fourth Political Theory article that I started this live stream with, there's the specific topic and then there's the general set of reflections. So the specific topic, I guess, is going to be about the need, or what if Israel had like a messianic king or something like that, which we're going to see in a second. But the general topic could interest you if you are a defender of monarchy, if you're thinking about theocracy, if you're wondering about alternatives to democracy, if you have a Christian version of this argument. So even though, it's going to be about the Israeli case, you can listen to it as though it can still teach you something about your specific set of interests, whether they're Christian, Islamic, secular, or what have you. Maybe you're going to be thinking about Curtis Yarvin and his defense of monarchy. As I read this, I don't know. But let's, with that out of the way, turn to the article and see what it says. So this is by Michael Wyshegrod, May 2010, A King in Israel, published in First Things magazine. Pretty sure it's not behind a paywall. Israel is a Jewish state, but has not succeeded in defining just what that means in a national constitution. So as I said earlier in this stream, Israel does not have a constitution, right? Although the 1948 Declaration of Independence called for the enactment of a constitution within months of the state's inception, nothing has been achieved beyond a fragmentary basic law. Israel finds itself in the uncomfortable position of fighting for its status as a Jewish state without a clear vision of what that entails. That is pretty interesting. If you're somebody who's like, America's got a constitution, and there are debates over America's constitution, including recently, if you see Elon Musk posting in response to the threat to the constitution posed in his view by the Democrats, Canada has a constitution, other countries have a constitution. Israel doesn't have a constitution. What other countries don't have a constitution? You start to think about it, it's pretty interesting. There appears to be an unbridgeable gap between 3 millennia of Jewish religious thought and the exigencies of modern governance. Yet, Judaism's defining concept, the covenant, is inherently political, and a proper understanding of biblical and rabbinic theology might identify a solution to Israel's constitutional vacuum. By the way, I got to say here, those of you who were here earlier on the stream and who are interested in this topic that I mentioned of Heideggerian Jewish thought, you should know, if I'm not mistaken, Michael Wyshegrod, he has a book called The Body of Faith. He's a theologian. He's got a book called The Body of Faith. And in that book, he discusses and he draws on Heidegger. So he's kind of like an Orthodox Jewish theologian whose theology is partly informed by Heidegger. So he's one of the few instances. I didn't even think about connecting the articles in that way, but I'm just telling you now that I recall. Okay. So there appears to be this unbridgeable gap between 3 millennia of Jewish religious thought and the exigencies of modern governance. And again, they're not defined by constitution because of Israel's constitutional vacuum. To discuss theological criteria for the constitution of a secular republic runs against the grain of modern political thought, even though constitutional restrictions on popular sovereignty imply reliance on an authority that is greater than human. In a republic, the people are sovereign, yet the purpose of a constitution is precisely to restrict the power of any future majority. If popular sovereignty is absolute, what right has a constitution to frustrate a future majority by, for example, imposing some form of supermajority? In the extreme case, suppose a majority of the delegates to a constitutional convention enacts a constitution that forbids any change forever or requires a 98% majority of the future legislature to enact any constitutional change. I'm going to interrupt here for a moment because I want to remind you that this is a general issue in political theory. What a constitution can permit and not permit. What is constitutional theory? Carl Schmitt wrote about it. I have a course at Millerman School on a book by Carl Schmitt called Legality and Legitimacy, which also deals with this question in its own way. So this is no different in principle from the 2/3 supermajority that the United States requires for constitutional amendments. The only basis for a polity to accept severe restrictions on popular majority rule is the conviction that the founding constitution derives its power from a higher form of sovereignty than the voters in any given legislative session. Without such a theological foundation, a republic cannot feel bound by the rules laid down by its founders. A purely secular republic would self-destruct because it could not protect its constitution from constant amendment. I have to show you something on this point. Again, these are, I would say, they're synchronicities, okay? They're unexpected connections between videos and books and topics. They show you that when you seriously study the foundations of political theory and political philosophy, you're in a conversation that spans all places and all times, okay? Because what Wyshegrod is saying, and I didn't know this because I didn't pre-read his article, is what I told you in my last video on Plato's laws, when I mentioned the question of the sovereignty of law or the legitimacy of law, and that according to Plato, and the first book of Plato's word on law is God. The first word in Greek of this book on Plato's laws is God. Actually, the first question is, did God or man give you your laws? Who do you say gave you your laws, a God or a man? And I pointed out that Plato's telling us that the problem of law is inseparable from the question of what legitimates the law. Is it just the people, or is it something higher than the people? Okay, that is a question that belongs to the essence of the problem of legislation, the problem of the political community, the problem of the constitution. And that's exactly what Visegrad is saying here. Okay, a purely secular republic would self-destruct because it could not protect its constitution from constant amendment. You have a crisis in the law if it's not secured by something higher. Okay, so back to the article. To propose a constitution, in other words, is to ask the question, what form of sovereignty is higher than that of the present voters? America's founders appealed to nature and nature's God. Judaism has an answer to this question, elaborated in the oral and written Torah, however remote they appear at first consideration from the practical requirements of the state of Israel. Can I pause the article for a minute to tell you? Plato has an answer too. Okay, what form of sovereignty is higher than that of the present voters? That is what Plato discusses in his great book, The Laws. I just launched a course on it in my school if you're interested. Let's go back to this article. Judaism is founded on a covenant between God and Israel. Instead of unilaterally imposing his will on Israel, God enters into a relation of mutual obligations with a people. This relation is in content not only religious, but political and legal, and it is understood in this fashion in the Bible and rabbinic literature, where God is called the King of all kings, perhaps more often than by any other appellation. God, moreover, exercises his kingship through proxies. There are three religious institutions and persons in the biblical polity who are divinely sanctioned: the king, the prophet, and the high priest. But of these three offices, only the term king is routinely applied to human beings as well as to God. This is noteworthy because of the three, the prophet and high priest hold religious functions, while the office of king is largely secular. In the presence of a human king, the following blessing is recited: Blessed are you, Hashem our God, King of the universe, who has given of his glory to flesh and blood. A human king thus participates in the glory of God. To see a human king is, in a sense, to see a proxy for God. A world without God is a world in which nothing is hereditary, but all glory is temporary and republican, elected for a period of time on the strength of the policy agreements of the day. God's election of Israel, which is in a sense a royal election, is based on none of these fleeting considerations, but is as permanent as the throne of David, the most permanent of all the earthly thrones sanctioned by God. It is probably for this reason that monarchy is so repugnant to secularists. Jewish sovereignty existed in full measure only during the rule of the kings of ancient Israel. Saul was chosen by God in response to the demand addressed by the people of Samuel to appoint for us a king to govern us like other nations. This is a request that did not please God, who informed Samuel that they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Only after Samuel has outlined all the disadvantages of rule by a human king, and the people persist in demanding a king, does God reluctantly instruct Samuel to anoint a human king. Let me just tell you, this book of Samuel, where the issue of the kingship comes up, has a long history of interpretation in Western political thought, but I just want to tell you one book. It's called The Beginning of Politics, Power in the Biblical Book of Samuel. Something like that. Okay, you'll find it. The Beginning of Politics, Power in the Biblical Book of Samuel. I think that's what it is. It studies the book of Samuel not as a holy text, so not like, a rabbinical commentary, but as a book that teaches us something about the nature of politics and political power. So if you're interested in this, this story of being asked to appoint a king to govern us and God rejecting it and Samuel outlining the disadvantages of rule by a human king, you can look at that book on The Beginning of Politics. From the way Israel's monarchy was founded, we can infer several things. First, human monarchy is not God's first choice for the government of Israel. His first choice is the kingship of God, who, because he does not speak to the people directly, uses a prophet to transmit the word of God to the people. In this form of rule exemplified by Moses' rule over Israel, God employs the prophet to communicate not only generalities to the people, but also concrete legal judgments. For example, the request of the daughters of Zelophehad for a portion of the inheritance in the absence of direct male heirs. Moses presents the case to God, who rules that the daughters are to inherit on the same footing as their father's brothers. I'm going to pause again because I want to make a comment. I want to make two comments, actually. In my video on Plato's Laws, I said it's kind of like Plato's Bible. And something that comes to mind here is that the laws of inheritance are discussed in Plato's Laws, just like they are discussed in the Hebrew Bible. So the prophet is a lawgiver, and therefore a book on law is also a book on prophecy. The other thing I wanted to tell you on the topic of prophecy, those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, you should know that there's a very thought-provoking discussion of prophecy in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, also translated as Guide of the Perplexed. He has a very thought-provoking analysis of prophecy. What is prophecy? Who is the prophet? What's the relationship of prophecy to intellect and imagination? So that's something you should look at when you can. Back to the article. A more concrete form of divine monarchical rule can hardly be imagined. Okay, so God the King is giving concrete laws. So a more concrete form of divine monarchical rule can hardly be imagined. While direct divine rule did not last very long, the fact that the first book of Samuel explicitly raises the option serves, among other things, to refute the view that with the giving of the Torah, direct divine intervention is no longer possible or desirable. Whatever subsequent forms of rule are depicted in the Bible, nothing can match direct divine rule, which rules out the possibility of error. Hold on, I think I want to comment on this. So let me read it again and then I'll make my comment, okay? While direct divine rule did not last very long, the fact that the first book of Samuel explicitly raises the option serves, among other things, to refute the view that with the giving of the Torah, direct divine intervention is no longer possible or desirable. Some time ago, I read on this channel a story from the Talmud about this question. Is direct divine intervention still desirable? Okay, the story is called The Oven of Achnai, Akhnai. I don't remember what that video was titled, okay, but it's actually a story that suggests that now that Jews have the Torah, God should stay out of it. Like, you already gave us the law. Now we can't appeal directly to you over and above the law because you've asked us to regulate our affairs through the law. So it seems to me like Wishgrad here is saying that that is incorrect. He's offering a different interpretation. He's saying that the Bible itself legitimates direct divine intervention, even though the Talmud, when it discusses this question, seems to take the opposite position. Whatever subsequent forms of rule are depicted in the Bible, nothing can match direct divine rule, which rules out the possibility of error. This form of government can be termed Mosaic kingship, a form of monarchy in which God himself is the monarch who speaks through the prophet. The Mosaic monarch thus combines in himself two characteristics that are in a way contradictory. On the one hand, Moses is the greatest prophet Israel has known because he speaks with God face to face. On the other hand, this proximity to God diminishes Moses' personal authority because when in doubt, he consults God and receives a direct answer. Moses, it seems, does not need to acquire the art of legal reasoning. His questions are answered by the Holy One. This may explain why Moses is not generally referred to as a king. Okay, I add here, he's usually referred to as a teacher, our teacher, Moses. Although he acts as a sovereign, God is the sovereign king and Moses his spokesman. By the way, I just want to tell you that even a phrase like face to face, when Moses sees God face to face, that's something that Maimonides interprets. Like, what does it mean to see God face to face if God is not a bodily person? Okay, so you should read Maimonides if any of this is interesting to you. The title of king is thus not an honorific for God, as is the title. The title of king is thus not an honorific for God, as if the title of God were insufficient. God is called king because he actually is the king, the ruler from whom all decisions emanate and whom human kings imperfectly resemble. The blessing of God, who has given of his glory to flesh and blood, encapsulates biblical and rabbinic political thinking. The human king is created in the image of the divine king, a statement we would not dare to make did it not mirror the statement that human beings were created in the image of God. The advantages of monarchy over a republican form of government can be debated at length. Since the French Revolution, monarchies have been on the wane and republics on the rise. The reasons are many, but the secularization of the modern world must be one of them, because the institution of monarchy is deeply tied to its religious roots, and the authority of the king is not derived from the governed. This is perhaps the aspect of monarchy that most offends the secular mind, for which nothing is more self-evident than the thesis that ultimately the people are sovereign, and rulers derive their legitimacy from those they rule. But this is not how Judaism understands the matter. God, not the people, is sovereign. Rulers are chosen by God, and it is only to God and his Torah they're responsible. I want to pause and make another comment because I was thinking about this yesterday too. I was reading Evola, Pagan Imperialism, and like many other right-wing Semites and right-wing anti-liberals, when he's criticizing Judaism and Jews, he's like, oh, Jews have given us the spirit of democracy. Jews have given us the spirit of socialism. You know, Jews give us like parliamentary democracy. Like he's linking all of these things he doesn't like, popular will, and political parties and all of that, to the, you know, Jewish/Christian/Protestant spirit, which is all negative. And he juxtaposes all of that to like the strong Roman pagan imperialism and to the idea of like a holy or sacred monarch. Then I'm thinking, well, Mr. Evola, you know, you wrote what you wrote when you did and why you did, but you should know that there are people like Michael Wyshegrod who are arguing for the same sort of thing. Not for pagan imperialism, but for Israel itself as being a divine monarchy where you don't actually have democracy and liberalism as your primary drivers. So that's why I say, you just have to try to piece these things together. And the only way you can do that is by reading a lot and reading carefully and thoughtfully. So back to the article. In classical Jewish thought, the question was how to establish the closest possible approximation to God's kingship. From the beginning of kingship in Israel, there was a deep ambivalence about monarchy, but the fact that a human king is accepted and serves as a substitute for the divine monarch bestows on the human king a political and religious weight that no democratically elected politician can ever achieve. There is no question that Jewish tradition favors monarchy, and Jewish religious authorities, prominently including Maimonides, consistently argue that the appointment of a king in the line of David is obligatory. For the same reason, the New Testament traces Jesus' descent to David. Jewish political thought seeks the political arrangement that most closely approximates the kingship of God, and absent a ruler from the house of David, monarchy becomes a contingent affair, which is why Jewish religious authorities in antiquity rejected Jewish monarchies, such as the Hasmoneans, not founded on the house of David. Of course, the question today is whether it is possible to reconcile the modern concept of a state with a religious concept of legitimacy more than 3 millennia old. I, Michael Wyshegrod writes, believe that it is indeed possible, and that such a reconciliation offers a practical solution to the long-standing constitutional dilemma of the state of Israel. So we're going to turn to that in a second. Okay, we said the constitutional dilemma is they don't have a constitution, therefore they're not defining well the relationship between the Jewish and the democratic elements of the state, which were present in its founding and reflected in some of its quasi-constitutional basic laws. And that can be reconciled, apparently, by bringing in a religious concept of legitimacy of God as king. Israel must reconcile the requirements of its secular citizens who wish to live in a modern parliamentary republic and its religious citizens who insist that religious and legal tradition must inform the Jewish state. The danger in secular rule is that modern Israel will fail to present itself unambiguously as a Jewish state and eventually lose the battle to remain a Jewish state. But the form of religious governance favored by the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox segment of the Israeli public, would put an end to Israel's republican character. I suspect, he writes, that the ultra-Orthodox would prefer a state governed by a self-appointed body of Torah scholars, similar to the Council of Torah Sages of Agudath Israel, the Haredi quasi-political organization. There has never been a moment in Jewish history, though, when the sovereign Jewish people were ruled by rabbinic scholars. Whether in the Babylonian exile or in medieval Europe, rabbis played an important role in guiding the lives of Jews, but this was always in the context of Jewish subordination to non-Jewish rulers. Jewish sovereignty existed in full measure only with the rule of Jewish kings. The crowning of an actual Davidic monarch today would require prophecy to select the proper person. In the absence of prophecy, this is impossible, and the sages of Israel declared almost 2,000 years ago that prophecy was gone from Israel. Israel, nonetheless, can be declared a Davidic monarchy without a reigning king. This action would build into the self-understanding of the state of Israel, the messianic hope of the Jewish people, while excluding a messianic interpretation of the present state of Israel. Okay, so you're going to have a monarchy without a monarch. The solution that I propose is by no means unusual for a constitutional monarchy. It is a common occurrence in monarchy that no king is present, or that the present king cannot rule, for example, due to youth. In such situations, a regent is appointed as a placeholder for a king. Such a placeholder can either be appointed or elected, a regent safeguarding the throne of David until such time that divine intervention identifies the rightful heir to the Davidic kingdom, would thus assume the functions now performed by Israel's president, the symbolic head of state. It would be quite possible for Israel's parliament to elect the regent who safeguards the throne, just as it now elects Israel's president. None of the other mechanisms of parliamentary democracy in Israel would need to change. Okay, so maybe that's an anti-Evolian point. He's like, nah, you guys are making a compromise on principle here. What is important is not the specific mechanism by which the Israeli polity might choose a regent, but rather for Israel to understand itself as a monarchy, albeit one without a reigning king. This would acknowledge God's will that Israel be ruled by the house of David, and it would define the Jewish character of the Israeli state. If we concede that any constitutional constraints on popular sovereignty derive from an authority higher than the people, we must conclude that a constitution uniquely suited to a Jewish state should embody the political form through which this higher authority has been manifest in the Jewish concept of polity for the past 3,000 years. To be a constitutionally Jewish state, Israel must understand itself as a monarchy temporarily without a king. Sorry, one moment. Such a constitutional monarchy is quite as compatible with modern parliamentary democracy as are the monarchies of Holland and England. But there would remain a fundamental difference between Israel and the European monarchies, which exist as a matter of historical happenstance. For Israel to establish its claim to be a Jewish state, the core issue of contention between Israel and many of its Muslim neighbors, it must do so in the unique way specified by the Bible and the undivided view of Jewish tradition. Collateral benefits might ensue from such a declaration. For example, the fact that several Arab countries are monarchies, including Israel's eastern neighbor, raises the prospect that a Davidic monarchy in Israel might elicit a certain degree of respect, which could be true. You know, I think when Israel acts like a sovereign, it does gain the respect of its neighbors, even if it's at war with its neighbors. The symbolic importance of acknowledging the house of David as Israel's rightful ruler, moreover, would be a source of inspiration to many Christians who are favorably disposed toward the Jewish state. The possible practical benefits, though, are incidental to the purpose of giving expression to the deep Jewish longing for a Davidic restoration, expressed so frequently and with such deep emotion in the daily liturgy that Jews have recited for thousands of years, in which we beseech God to see a descendant of David on the throne of Israel. Okay, that was an article in 2010, First Things magazine. Michael Wyshegrod, author of The Body of Faith, a political theorist, Israeli theologian, and Heideggerian, if I'm not mistaken, to some extent. So if you found that to be interesting, I gave you a few places you could look for more. If you look into the fact that Israel does not have a constitution, but only these basic laws and how they've been interpreted, that's an interesting topic. If you want to study the book of Samuel in kind of a non-explicitly religious context, you can read that book called The Beginning of Politics that I mentioned. If you want to know about the problem of divine legitimacy for a constitutional order, you should definitely study Plato's book called The Laws. And if you found this interesting for other reasons, then you should read more of Michael Wishegrod's writings and see what you think about that. So they should declare constitutionally that they are a Davidic monarchy with a regent as they reawait the return of prophecy, because only through prophecy will they be able to know who is the rightful king of Israel from the Davidic line. So I assume that Christians have their own pretty unambiguous answer to that. But in contemporary Israeli politics, that would be one possible way of identifying the Jewish character of the state at a time where it's constitutionally ambiguous. Okay, so that was interesting to read. I hope that you enjoyed that. I did have one more article. I'm not going to read it because it's just, I got to move on to something else now for this morning. I'll show you what it is. You can read it yourselves if you want. It's in Tablet Mag, so tabletmag.com. The article is called Killing Nasrallah by Lee Smith. I haven't read it yet, but I assume it's a nice up-to-date account of just what happened with the Israeli strike. And I know some of you have that on your mind, whether because you support Israel or because you don't, or just because you think this is changing the lay of the land in the Middle East, and therefore you want to learn more about what's going on. You might want to take a look at that. Again, I haven't read it, so I can't wholeheartedly recommend it, but it's what I plan to read. Okay, so this was a live stream where we covered how to study controversial thinkers. I mentioned Alexander Dugin as a controversial thinker, Zionism and Zionist political theory as a controversial topic, the experiment of mashing the two together, using Dugin to think about Zionism in a positive light, even though Dugin is an anti-Zionist, as are most of his followers. We talked about not getting overly seduced by a controversial thinker. You have to still keep your wits about you. We talked about not just being a lemming, like when you become a contrarian, there are other contrarians too, and you might find yourself just aping, what they ape in that community, and suddenly you become like, a dogmatic flat earther, whereas you thought that by being a flat earther, you're going to be anti-dogmatic because you're going against the mainstream. So you got to keep your wits about you. We said it's important when you study a controversial thinker to just read carefully and thoughtfully, and not necessarily to throw the book down the first time you see something you don't like. So when Julius Evola says that he's anti-European, anti-Christian, anti-humanitarian, anti-Semitic, anti-philosophical, anti-aesthetic, you might think that means it's time to stop reading him, but not necessarily. There's still something to learn. And when you read Bronze Age Pervert and he says whatever he says there, or selective breeding and the birth of philosophy, I can't read a book that brings philosophy and breeding together in the title. That's outlandish. Okay, so you read a controversial thinker, you have to learn when to sort of like suspend your judgment long enough to have enough of an understanding of what's being said that you can have your, of course, you're going to have your inclinations and your reactions and your automatic like or dislike, but keep it in check. That's what I'm saying. Then we saw this article on conservative hot girls, okay, which was a sort of a comic reprieve, and this article on a king in Israel, okay, about the general issue of how do you legitimate a code of law in a modern secular context if everything depends on the will of the people, but the Constitution is supposed to be a check on the will of the people, should be a check that comes from a source higher than the will of the people. That's a problem that is studied by Plato, by Carl Schmitt, by Rousseau, by other thinkers and philosophers. And we saw Michael Wyshegrad's argument in the Israeli case that Israel should just accept that it is a divine monarchy, even in the absence of a specific monarch to fill the role, by declaring themselves a Davidic monarchy with a regent, a kind of placeholder for the return of prophecy. I also mentioned a few times throughout this live stream, Maimonides, if you're interested in Jewish thought, like what is prophecy? How do you interpret a phrase like Moses seeing God face to face? What is the Jewish law? Maimonides is a nice source for that if you have the time and patience. And there's a new translation, like I mentioned, that you can work through if you want to. So that was this live stream. I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Michael Millerman. I teach online at millermanschool.com. Obviously, I teach on this channel. So if you enjoyed this, like, share, subscribe, comment, let people know, help the channel grow. The more activity is, the more I feel inspired to spend my time here with you. If you'd like to support the channel, some people have asked me, you can just make a donation or a super chat or something like that. That's always much appreciated. And that's it. I wish you well in your studies. Have a great day. Goodbye. Take care. Until next time.